The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
After more than 7 long years and nearly 4,500 soldiers killed, the U.S. has ended its combat mission in Iraq. Still, 50,000 U.S. troops remain on the ground. And in Afghanistan, violence intensifies as a new U.S. commander takes over the fight against an emboldened Taliban. Meanwhile, President Obama recently hosted a new round of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks against a backdrop of ongoing tensions with an Iranian regime that continues to resist international pressure. We'll discuss these recent developments and their implications next, during office hours. Hi, I'm Ken Goldstein, political science professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. What is the status of the American military operation in Afghanistan? What does the change in mission in Iraq actually mean? Does the nuclear situation in Iran and their recent unveiling of combat drones change the balance of power? Is there real hope for an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement? Joining me to discuss the United States' current role in the Middle East and across the globe are two familiar office hours faces, Professors John Pevehouse and Andrew Kydd. Pevehouse is a professor of political science here in Madison and an expert on international relations and U.S. foreign policy. Kydd is also a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin and an expert on nuclear weapons, international security, and conflict resolution. Gentlemen, welcome to office hours, welcome back to office hours, welcome back to the new office hours set. Both of you have been on the show a number of times. We've talked about many of these issues previously. Let's start with Iraq. John, President Obama's speech, the official end of combat operations, we go below 50,000 troops, it has a new name, New Dawn. What's the actual difference? What's the actual significance of this?
Twofold. One is the symbolic significance that was really marked in part by his speech and by his address, where he was really trying to do two competing things. One, continue this sort of traditional mantra that he had had all through the election of, I think the war was wrong, but you know, we're there and now we have to deal with it. And given the circumstances, we've done okay, right? The surge has been relatively effective. And that by moving away from direct combat operations, I think the practical significance is turning a lot of the power over to Iraqi commanders in the Iraqi military. Does this mean we're done fighting in Iraq? Maybe not. Clearly we're on standby, we're there for support services, we're there to continue training, we're there to continue support for infrastructure. So by no means are we out of Iraq, but as the phrase goes, the major combat operations are now, at least in the short term, wrapped up.
And these metrics that we've talked about in the past, and you mentioned some of them, infrastructure, the Iraqis are able to take over their own security operations, the formation of a government, where does that stand now? Still a lot of danger here.
Absolutely, and that's why I say in the short term it's clear we've ceased this. I mean, I don't see us going back in with a very large number of troops, but clearly there's still a lot of uncertainty. Let's start with the government. You know, at post-elections there's still a lot of controversy over the government itself and whether this is going to be a stable, can you even form a stable set of governance institutions in Iraq, given the way the country is split and given the varying power of the different groups between the Kurds, the Shia, and the Sunnis. And so I think that is the biggest question mark for me. It's the political future of Iraq and what it looks like. You know, I don't see it becoming a civil war anytime soon, but you can have a lot of instability that can give insurgents and can give those who would work against the government just some breathing space, some opening to work against the government. Infrastructure, not looking too bad. Police training, military training, looking okay. You know, not as bad as it was 2 years ago, even a year ago. Quite a bit of progress made there, which is, I think, is why the U.S. felt pretty good about going ahead and ending the operations, because there was this out, you know, even with the status of forces agreements, had both sides said, well, we're a little nervous about pulling out at this particular historical moment. I think you would have seen the U.S. stay in or would have seen an extension, something along those lines. Didn't happen. They went full steam ahead. And I think that is at least some evidence that at least the U.S. commanders in the region have some, at least minimal confidence in security forces, in the infrastructure in Iraq.
Andy, this pivot that John talked about in the speech was interesting as we pivot to talking about Afghanistan. So Barack Obama arguably wins the Democratic nomination because of his strong opposition to the Iraq war, also opposed the surge at the time, but he always considered Afghanistan the good war, if you will. When he became president, he doubled down in Afghanistan. What's the situation in Afghanistan? Because I have to say, we've discussed it here before, and it feels like a little bit of Groundhog Day. We talked about Afghanistan was a tough place to fight a war. We talked about a corrupt government, and we talked about the Pakistanis meddling. Mm-hmm. And we're talking here in fall of 2010 about
all the same things, and in many ways getting worse, which is the unfortunate thing, certainly for the Obama administration and for the people in Afghanistan. You see on a lot of these matrices things going from bad to worse. Revelations of deeper corruption reaching higher up into the Karzai government, including his own brother, making a lot of money off of.
And we thought they were pretty corrupt before, and now you're saying
we thought they were pretty corrupt before, and
corrupt.
more and more is coming out. This recent Afghan bank coming to the brink of bankruptcy because of shady deals with insiders, and a host of other matrices. I thought one of the most outrageous things that happened recently was about a year ago we arrested a top operational commander in the Taliban, really the #2 guy in the organization, in Pakistan, and we thought this was a great coup at the time. And then only recently it came out that the Pakistanis let us arrest that guy because he was opening a secret channel for peace negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government and the United States without the Pakistanis being on board. And the Pakistani, some folks in the Pakistani military and intelligence services decided that they needed to reassert control, and so they let the Americans arrest him, apparently, to shut down that channel for negotiations. So this is something the Obama administration would like to do, peel off moderates in the Taliban, negotiate some sort of way out of this conflict, and the Pakistanis are saying, no, we're not going to let you do that.
Okay.
Our supposed ally.
Our supposed ally. I want to connect the dots on that a little bit more when we come back. Please stay with us as we discuss current events in the Middle East and around the globe with John Pevehouse and Andy Kydd on Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Where others saw lumber, we recognized a treasure. Where others saw the night, we chose the stars. Where others saw pieces, we unlocked the puzzle that could mean the end of paralysis and cancer. Since 1848, thinkers and achievers at Wisconsin have fearlessly sought ideas that transform the world. Keep on, Wisconsin. Keep on.
Welcome back to Office Hours, discussing Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and the Middle East peace process with John Pevehouse and Andy Kydd. So Andy, connect the dots a little bit for me on that last point you were making. There's been this critique of the Obama administration that they don't get how things work, and this was a double or triple game being played by Pakistani intelligence here.
Sure, the Pakistani intelligence, I mean, Pakistan is nominally our ally in what used to be called the Global War on Terror, and which now has a much less provocative name, and particularly in Afghanistan. And so we give them lots of aid and lots of assistance, and we hope that they will attack the Taliban in their own territory as well as against the Taliban in Afghanistan. But it's clear, it's abundantly clear, that they are actually supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they have historically supported the Taliban in Afghanistan. They really only abandoned them fairly temporarily in the aftermath of 2001 when we initially went in there. And the reason is because they want to have a friendly regime in Afghanistan. They are paranoid about Indian influence. Their main struggle, main conflict is with India, and they think that India is going to forge some sort of alliance with Afghanistan unless they control what's going on in Afghanistan. So they want to maintain control there. The United States, of course, is trying to get them to help out in the war on terror, but they are not able to persuade them of the logic of doing so when it would seem to undercut their own national interests.
So this story really points to a bigger picture, bigger problem or contradiction in our policy in Afghanistan. We have maybe a 1-year or 2-year time horizon, and one of the reasons why Pakistani intelligence is probably doing this is, well, if the Americans aren't there, they have to take care of their own concerns there. But what you hear a lot of people say is that Why should anyone in Afghanistan make a deal with the U.S. or the U.S. military? And there's great incentive for the Taliban to just lay low because Barack Obama said we're going to start to draw down in August. Is that a valid critique of administration policy?
You know what, I think it is. And the sad part is I think it's an unnecessary one. You know, Obama's saying, well, you know, come next July, come next August, we'll start our withdrawal of the troops. And Petraeus has said, well, maybe. And everyone thinks that that is, in fact, the answer. It's, well, maybe. Because if you'll remember, every time this withdrawal date gets set, it's if conditions permit. Well, who knows what that means? No one's actually been able to define that. Not even the military will actually come out and define what these conditions that would permit would look like. So there is, I think, a lot of critique about, you know, imagine, as you said, right? Imagine yourself ranging from some, civilian elite in Kandahar all the way down to some villager, in Helmand province. And in the morning, the U.S. military comes and knocks on your door and says, have you seen any insurgents? Swear your allegiance to us and the government. And at night, here comes the Taliban guy knocking too. Well, who do you think is going to be there in 10 years, right? Everyone knows it's probably going to be the Taliban and not the United States, even under ideal circumstances. And so, when you set that deadline, I think there is this perception that, oh, well, now they've said they're not going to stick around. But again, why I say it's kind of an ironic situation they find themselves in reality, I think we're going to be there for 5, 6, 7 years potentially, even though we've said we're not going to be. And so it's a lose-lose, right? We're going to be there, we're going to be kind of stuck there for a long period of time, but yet we're not getting the benefits of telling anyone we're going to be stuck there for a long period of time because this statement came out that, oh, well, we're going to be gone in a year and a half.
So in Obama's speech, this is a pretty unambiguous statement. Next August, we will begin, I guess that's the wiggle room, a transition to Afghan responsibility. The pace of our troop reductions will be determined by conditions on the ground, and our support for Afghanistan will endure. But make no mistake, this transition will begin because open-ended war serves neither our interests nor the Afghan people's. So Andy, we can parse those words, but as John was saying, the villager in Helmand province is hearing, they're not hearing this, they're hearing we're going, right?
A lot of people are hearing we're going, but of course there's a reason for it. It wasn't done just for the fun of it, or even just for domestic politics. It was done because, and the same mechanism at work in Iraq, because there's a feeling that if the United States announces an unending commitment, we'll stay for as long as we want, we'll stay forever. Number one, people don't like that because they don't want America to stay forever. They think that's imperialism. And number two, the United States wants the Afghans to assume the burden of their own governance and their own self-defense against the Taliban, just as we did in Iraq. And so if you say we'll be there forever, that gives no incentive for the government to fight corruption effectively, to train forces effectively, to field an army capable of taking on the Taliban. If you think Uncle Sam is going to do it for you, why bother? Why not just keep your hand in the till and build your villa in the suburbs and keep your money in a Swiss bank account? If you think the Taliban is going to be coming knocking at your door in the center, then that's when you need to fight seriously. You need to devote your resources to fighting rather than to luxurious living. And so the hope is it will light a fire under people and get them to actually defend themselves.
When we return on break, let's talk about whether that sweet spot is achievable in getting that message across and whether there really is that analogy between what we were trying to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. So please stay with us as we continue to talk about Afghanistan here on Office Hours. Welcome back to Office Hours. John Pevehouse and Andy Kydd, both colleagues of mine in the Department of Political Science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. John, Andy sketched out the rationale about why you don't want to have an open-ended commitment, because if you have an open-ended commitment, they'll just let U.S. troops fight forever. But there are differences between Iraq and Afghanistan and us getting that sweet spot correct on giving them an incentive to fight on their own.
Absolutely. There are two, in my mind, there are at least two key differences. One is that there's a complete lack of civil society. There's a lack of governmental institutions. Afghanistan is a clan-based society. Parts of Iraq were too. I don't want to say clans were unimportant in terms of governance in Iraq, but Afghanistan just has no strong history of a central state, a central administration. Part of counterinsurgency assumes that what you're competing with against the counterinsurgents has some stability, non-corrupt governmental structure behind it. So I think that's which There was at least some semblance of that in Iraq, missing that in Afghanistan. The second thing, and I think we don't appreciate this enough oftentimes, is, when Iraq was at its worst, this was partially kind of inter-ethnic conflict, but it was also a lot of al-Qaeda in Iraq just blowing up anything they could blow up. They were blowing up civilians. They weren't actually blowing up the U.S. military that much. They were going after civilians. And this ticked off the average Iraqi. And so the average Iraqi begins to make this calculation. Hey, even if the U.S. isn't going to be here, I don't like these guys. I don't want to throw my lot in with these guys. The Taliban, and if you believe these polls in Afghanistan, the Taliban is still unpopular.
And al-Qaeda was not organic to Iraq.
No, that's right. And they were mostly, they were oftentimes, most of the time, coming from the outside. The Taliban, they're organic. People, on one hand, don't like them. And if you believe these polls, 89, 90% still say, no, we don't want the Taliban in power. But yet the Taliban isn't going around inflicting a lot of civilian casualties. They're actually attacking U.S. troops. They're attacking international troops. And, the Afghanis see this and they think, well, they're providing them services. We may not like them, but, again, they're going to be here in 10 years, the U.S. isn't. So who do we throw our lot in with? And so I think those are sort of the tactics of the two insurgencies was very different, and I think that makes the counterinsurgency tactics, therefore, more difficult in the Afghanistan case than it was in the Iraq case.
Maybe it's just an example of how difficult the situation is in Afghanistan, that when we have the starting of new peace, Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, that people are wildly optimistic about them. Why was there, even though I think there was a fair amount of cynicism as the talks started in Washington, this reaction afterwards, which was, I'm not sure they actually said this in Arabic or Hebrew, wow, that sort of went better than we thought it would, and we're a little bit more optimistic. Why was that the case?
Well, I think you're at a moment where, strangely, a deal is coming into view that might actually be feasible. And I actually went to Israel a couple of weeks ago and talked to a bunch of people there, and heard a lot of people.
On both sides.
On both sides, on the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli side. And I encountered almost universal pessimism about whether peace was possible. And one of our colleagues on the trip said, well, when you hear almost universal agreement about something, it's got to be wrong. So that gave us grounds for optimism. But another aspect that gave us grounds for optimism was that a number of people said, well, the deal that will be implemented is clear. And they would tick off things about the borders, the settlements, the status of Jerusalem, the holy places, and kind of go down the list and say, here's the deal that's been all but agreed to by various people on the Israeli and the Palestinian side. The only problem being, of course, it has been agreed to by the governmental leaders on both of those sides. And on the Palestinian side, you've got a leadership that basically accepts that deal that's been hammered out informally. And on the Israeli side, so far, you have a leadership which doesn't, Netanyahu, the prime minister. And so that suggests that political pressure could be brought to bear, and it actually has been accepted more or less by his main opposition leader, Tzipi Livni, in the Israeli Knesset. So it suggests you've got basically one person there who's blocking the deal at this point, who could be conceivably persuaded to accept it. And you're beginning to hear hints out of his office that there might be some more flexibility there. So I think that's giving people a lot of optimism.
Okay, let's continue this discussion of the first track of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks in 1 second when we come back on Office Hours. Please stay with us.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours. John Pevehouse and Andy Kydd. So we have a couple minutes here now to solve the Arab-Israeli impasse as well. Andy made the point that Abbas wants a deal, but can Abbas deliver on a deal? He's technically been, there's been president without elections. He's absolutely not in control of Gaza, which is controlled by Hamas. He may not even be in control of Fatah. As much as he wants a deal, can he deliver it?
That's a great question. When it comes to someplace like Gaza, I think the answer is clearly no. When it comes to Ramallah and portions of the West Bank, potentially. I think the answer is potentially. I don't think it's a guarantee by any stretch. But, parts of Ramallah are now sort of growing. They've developed civil society. I was reading the other day, things like personal checks, like the personal banking sector is now kind of up and running. There's like some semblance of civil society coming. And in a situation like that, where you have some relatively weak but nascent democratic or at least political institutions, potentially, although I think it's an uphill battle for him. And the
people have something to lose now.
And the people have something to lose, that's right. And I think think the real question is, if Abbas does the deal, what does Hamas do? Then does Hamas then try to become the spoiler through Gaza somehow, in some way? And that's always possible.
And with Netanyahu, he made what I thought was an interesting statement, and something that I thought was pretty unique. He said, "But we recognize that another people share this land with us, and I come here to find an historic compromise that will enable both peoples to live in peace, security, and dignity." And someone who's followed Bibi Netanyahu, that's not a typical statement from him. Could he be Nixon in China? Could he be the conservative, the right-wing leader who, even though in his heart he may not want that deal, but he's the one who can bring Israelis around to it?
I think he certainly could be. I think there's no question about that. There have been other statements out of his office recently saying things like, if we can get an ironclad recognition of Israel and abandonment of violence out of the Palestinian side, that can change the status quo. I think that was the phrase used radically in the Prime Minister's office, or the Prime Minister's mind. So I think he certainly could be. I mean, he's got the stature on the right in Israeli politics to do that, if anybody does. And so I think one could be optimistic about that, in the same way that Ariel Sharon, the leader of the right in the early 2000s, led Israel to withdraw from Gaza. You could see Netanyahu making a deal with the Palestinians of an even more historic nature to set up a Palestinian state for the first time on the West Bank.
And we only have a little bit of time left, but it's clear that Netanyahu sees Iran as Israel's existential enemy, and he's trying to buy himself some strategic time or depth here from the Americans.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, with the Israeli deterrent looking the way it is, he sees this as an existential threat. I think he's trying to, and you could see the quid pro quo here, right, of, you know, you give me pressure, give me aid to do this, but I also need security guarantees, not just for an Israeli state, but vis-a-vis the Iranian threat too.
Andy, John, thanks for joining us in Office Hours. We will have you back again soon, because sadly, I think all of these issues are not going to be solved in the short term. Thanks to all of you for joining us today on Office Hours. Don't forget, Office Hours is on the web via our university website, Facebook, or even Twitter. Take a look and let us know your thoughts. From the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this has been Office Hours. Thanks for stopping by.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.